I'm sure you all know who Edmund is. Artist, author, prize-winning author of The Hare with Amber Eyes, which I think first brought him to global attention 15 years ago now. He's since written a couple more books and staged many exhibitions, both with commercial galleries and institutions around the world. So we're going to talk about the influences on his career, his life and his career, and the anxiety of influence as well, whether there can be such a thing as too much influence, and how you deal with that, and how you deal with, as any of you who have read The Hare with Amber Eyes will know, a very storied and conflict-rich, I guess, family history. So, Edmund, first, let's talk about The Hare with Amber Eyes. It's about these small Japanese sculptures called netsuke, which were owned by your, and we're going to have some images, which are by your family and had been in your family's possession for about 150 years, from Paris to Vienna to Japan to London. Can you just tell us a bit about how you came to research that story?
The first thing I'd like to say is I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, so thank you so much for having me. My God, thank you. There's people standing. I'll make this short. And Josh, thank you for being in conversation. So yes, I mean, the story of how these objects came into my life and how, and their presence within my family. What was your question?
I'm lost already. When you came to write the book, how did you develop the story?
Well, the reality is that when I was 17, I ran away from school to Japan to be a potter. Now I have kids, I'm pretty terrified about the running away bit, but I ended up in Japan because Japan is the great potter's country. It's the country where ceramic traditions are extraordinary and rich, and a continuum of traditions are there. And I spent 6 months there making pots with sort of elderly, quite cross Japanese potters. And then at the end of the summer, I ended up in Tokyo with very long hair, very grubby, on the doorstep of my great uncle, Ignace von Ephrussi, Iggy, who was an elderly, Jewish, aristocratic man living in Tokyo, and he opened the front door, beautifully, impeccably dressed, like you, and he gave me a kiss on both cheeks. He had a pocket square in his, sorry, I'm being reminiscing here, but a pocket square, and he kissed me on both cheeks, and I went into his room, and there was beautiful music playing, and he gave me a whiskey sour for the first time in my life. I was 17, and he waved an arm in this beautiful, beautiful Tokyo apartment at a whole wall, vitrine, a glass case full of netsuke, and he said, "There's a story." And I stayed with him, and he made me go and buy new clothes, and we became friends. And then when he died, decades later, I got to know him and went back and spent so much time with this wonderful émigré man. I found that I had inherited this collection of these extraordinary, funny, beautiful, erotic, delightful little things. And I had them in our house in South London, and I realized that they were, and this is probably the heart of our conversation, George, that objects are questions. They're not answers, they are generative, complex beginnings of things. And I realized I had a sort of responsibility to them. And then, that took me, to this whole story, which I can...
Well, give us the outline of the story of the netsuke, how they came into your family and what happened.
In short, because ridiculously rich Jewish family from Odessa. End of the 18th century, the Ephrussi family, and they're like good, like the Rothschilds. They send their children out across Europe to marry good Jewish girls and become even richer, and half the family ends up here in the Rue de Monceau, and they start buying extraordinary collections of Medici embroideries, characteristically this had M for Medici and the unstitched M and put E for Ephrussi, which tells you about the sort of oligarchical tendency. Half the family ends up in Paris and starts collecting extraordinary Impressionist art, including Charles Ephrussi, who's the youngest son, who is a wonderful art collector and writer. And half the family go to Vienna, which gets more complicated. But here, he buys incredible. This is in the Met, annoyingly. He buys incredibly beautiful Impressionist paintings, and here he is in the back of his friend Renoir's boating party in the top hat, and he's an extraordinary believer in contemporary art. And so when he buys this, which is meant to be 800 francs, he gives them 1,000 francs, and this arrives Tuesday afterwards in the Rue de Monceau with a little note saying, this one has slipped through the bundle. And he, Charles Ephrussi, this wonderful flanneurial Jewish collector, buys this collection of netsuke to have in dinner parties to hand round. So that's where the collection begins.
And it gets given to the Vienna family as a wedding gift, isn't it?
It gets given to my great-grandparents, who have, in typical Viennese fashion, decided to rather up the ante by building a bigger house, which is a block of the Ringstrasse. It's an astonishing palais, Ringstrasse palais, incredible interiors, ballrooms, and so on. And this is where the Viennese cousins are living. And Charles sends this great collection of netsuke, as a wedding present to my great-grandparents. And this is my great-grandmother, Emmy, in characteristically down at heel attire.
Just a casual Tuesday in the Palais Ephrussi.
This is TEFAF. This is how you dress up. Della Robbia, extraordinary old master paintings, a whole house of treasures, and wonderfully in the dressing room of Emmy, she puts this collection of netsuke, this vitrine of netsuke. And this is where it changes. Paris, it's about collecting. Here, it's about family life. And this is where my grandmother and her sister dress up, and they play with these little objects, become toys, as Emmy dresses, to be part of a Viennese world. And my great-uncle, this is my grandmother, a very literary, wonderful person who I adore, and Iggy, a young, wonderful man who is gay and doesn't want to be the next banker in the generation, and runs away to New York to be, in his words, the worst fashion designer on the east coast of America, which was actually true. But the netsuke have changed from Paris to Vienna, and then just tragically, this is the hard bit. This is the Anschluss. This is the breaking down of the doors of the Palais Ephrussi, the systematic looting of the house, partly by the Kunsthistorische Museum curators who arrived the day after the Anschluss to choose what pictures to do. And my great-grandmother, that beautiful woman, commits suicide. My great-grandfather's scholarly man is made to scrub the streets. And finally, in exile to England, Iggy joins the American army. He fights across Europe on D-Day. And then, amazingly, after the war, my grandmother goes back to this ruined city, to this ruined house. And the only thing that's left of the collection is the netsuke, which my great-grandmother's maid had kept while the Gestapo were ransacking the house. And the maid gives them back to my grandmother, and the story goes on.
I was rereading The Hare with Amber Eyes ahead of our conversation, and I remember reading it 15 years ago, and I cried at exactly the same place, which is where the maid says, "I've saved these for you."
It's many things, one of the strange privileges about giving a collection. This is Iggy in Japan with his partner Jiro. He builds a house for the netsuke. and here he is after dinner handing them round again. And here is the grave of Giro and Iggy, and this is the grave where I say Kaddish for my Jewish great uncle. But the handing on of these objects, this is why we're here. The handing on of the objects isn't a safe thing. It wasn't just a beautiful, pretty collection of objects. It was the only thing. It was the only thing that survived from that whole dynastic collecting Jewish philanthropic European, pan-European collecting. That was the one thing that got through. And it got through miraculously. And then it was held by all these different people. And then it ends up with me. And I'm a potter in South London with small children. And I say to Sue, my wife, I say, I'll take a few months off and I'll write a book.
And how many years later?
It's 7 years.
7 years.
And no one wants to publish it because it's Jewish memoir, and it's 7 years. But it does something. I do it for myself. I think that's the reality.
And I think that's the only reason to write or to make art, isn't it? Because you yourself have to do it, you can't not. Were you surprised by the reaction? I mean, it sounds like if no one wanted it, you think, okay, well, it'll come out and maybe it'll do something, but it really did a lot.
I am profoundly, deeply, ridiculously amazed.
It's a nice state to be. As a writer and as an editor, when I read your books, all of them, I was about to say, it feels like you write with your fingers. I mean, I write with my fingers too, but you have a particularly tactile sense. Did you have to work to develop that language, or did it come quite naturally to you? Because when we read you, we feel you feeling these objects, and we feel them ourselves.
I don't know. Is one answer. The other answer is I absolutely know, because the thing for me is I'm on some strange sort of spectrum of where objects and words are very, very close. Language and objects are very close. So I feel the physicality of words intensely. And in fact, my installations are poems. The way I put the objects down in the world and space them out feel to me like poems or paragraphs, or I see pages. But the tactility, to go back to your actual question, sorry, Josh, I'm rambling
please.
here.
No.
Is really important for me. It's one of the great mysteries to me is that there's not more profound writing about touch and art. We're hugily visually literate about and the literature of the visual arts in criticism is extraordinary, but actually the touch, the language of touch has gone, and that's partly, I have to say, that sort of the thinning out of connoisseurial language, because 200 years ago, people would have opened up a vitrine, they would have had a Kunstkammer, they would have a Wunderkammer, they would have passed things round, they would have understood how materials work in the hand and been able to talk about them. And that, apart from you, who are here, so you know what you're talking about, in general, that's thinned out totally. So I want that to happen. I want people to understand what happens when you pick something up.
And it's probably the first of the senses to go in the virtual world, isn't it? Everything else is, I mean, maybe scent, but everything else is pretty useful still. We look and we speak, but...
Yeah, I mean, if the only use of your hand is to swipe something, I mean, God help us all.
So stop swiping. And if you're watching this online, also stop swiping, please. Let's talk about let's talk about influence.
Yeah.
How do you think, and these things are not one-to-one, but how do you think learning about your family history, the netsuke, the tragedy and the glory of it, how do you think that filters into your work, if it does? Does it make a difference in terms of the way you put things together, the kind of objects that you make?
So, I inherited the netsuke quite late on in my life. I'm very, very old, So this happens quite. Before I inherit the netsuke, I have been apprenticed. I started making pots as a child. I was, as a 5-year-old, I was working seriously from the age of 12. I was apprenticed at 17, for goodness sake. All this stuff. So there's a lot of making that happens before the book happens, before that particular journey happens. What it does do is to crystallize something really, really important to me, which is that objects in the world are diasporic. They move. They move between hands, between collections, across borders, and they bring with them all that kind of generative, wonderful storytelling and power. But they also lose stories as they go. Things get erased or broken or defaced. And there are extraordinary things within this fair where you can feel the caesuras, the gaps in the storytelling. So what I've got is that sort of pool of influence of making pots all across the world, particularly Japan and China and Korea. But then in comes this life-changing inheritance. And then I have to think about loss. And I have to think about how the hell do I tell this story? Which is really basically a story about my elderly father with a strong Viennese accent not telling me anything about his childhood. Because, quotes, there is nothing to tell, there's nothing to remember, I don't remember anything about it. So, and I've got my children growing up, and I want my dad to talk or think or connect to the Holocaust, and I want my children to learn about it. And the way to do that is to start making and thinking about how the objects I make in the world can be held together.
And how you can use them to encapsulate a story, even though they come from a tradition. The part of your family's tradition is that very grand empire 19th century style, and your work actually almost revolts against that in some ways.
Yeah, I don't sort of hang out we don't have a palais at home.
The Palais de South London.
The Palais de South London. There are a few restituted pictures, but my God, there are lots that there's someone making some porcelain noise in the background. Kintsugi will happen later on. So yeah, you look at my work and it's porcelain, which has its own huge storytelling about place and journeying. And it's minimal, to use a horrible phrase, in the sense that it's not decorated. The colours and the glazes are very austere. So how does that relate to the ballrooms of my grandparents? Not much, but for me, there's a profound connection there.
I think that's what I found interesting, that one can say minimalist, but actually the things that have soaked into it are so rich and deep that it's superficial to say minimalist, isn't it? It's to ignore it's a stylistic judgment rather than a full judgment.
Yes, minimalism is a very blunt. I'm afraid I brought it up, so it's my fault. But it's a very blunt word for extraordinary and complicated things. What it does suggest, though, is a kind of attention to particular things, to structure, to the sort of score, if I can use that sort of John Cage-like thing, how things can be put down in the world and you can connect them in lucid ways. That was a rubbish answer.
No, I think it made sense. In your book, Letters to Commando, you talk about European porcelain. You say not knowing when to stop is pretty much a definition of European porcelain,
yes.
and that seems to track. That seems to track quite well with your answer about.
I talk about one of my books, and I can't remember where, an extraordinary early Meissen piece that my grandmother had, my great-grandmother had, my grandmother had. And I said it's passive-aggressive porcelain, in the sense that there's just more and more and more and more and more all about it. But what I get from that, when I think about porcelain, I think about alchemy. I think about, my God, the struggle to make porcelain in the world, whether if it's in Jingdezhen in China, or it's in Dresden, in Meissen, or wherever. It's that thinking that you want to make something pure and beautiful in the world. That's extraordinary. Absolutely, it remains extraordinary.
And then you paint shepherdesses on it.
And then you might drop it, as the people next door have just done.
Let's go back to Vienna.
Yeah.
After The Hare with Amber Eyes came out, a number of opportunities came your way, one of which was to curate a show at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which, as you said, their curators had been involved in expropriating your family's work. How did it feel to go back in that context to that place, knowing what you knew now?
So really, really, really difficult. Can I put some more into that, emphasis into that?
Yes, another really would do it.
Yeah. We all love the Kunsthistorische Museum. You go up those extraordinary steps and you can turn left into the Wunderkammer, you can turn right into Egypt, you can go up to the sculpture of Tasius and then into those great enfilade rooms of some of the greatest paintings in the world. And yet, that sort of reckoning that Austria never really has done with the war, which I feel that Germany has done, that reckoning that Austria hasn't done, presented me with a real issue. And can I put in brackets here that I've just reclaimed my Austrian citizenship?
I was going to ask, so let's come to it.
We might come back to that.
Yeah.
So the invitation came, and it's an extraordinary opportunity. It was an invitation to do anything I wanted in the Kunsthistorische Museum. So I said, what I want to do is to find the broken things in the collection, which caused absolute horror in the curators. This is being filmed. It is being filmed, isn't it?
It's fine. They know it.
Okay.
They know it now.
So what I did was what I took was that extraordinary image of Dürer. I don't think I've got a picture of it. You can just see it in the foreground here. It's the great, amazing watercolor that Dürer did of a nightmare. He wakes up in the middle of the night and the heavens have opened. It's it's the first autographed Western image of a nightmare. And he says, it's the middle of the night during Shrove Tuesday, and the heavens have opened and I've seen the end of the world. And this is in the Kunsthistorische Museum. So I called the exhibition During the Night. A nighttime in Vienna for me is Kristallnacht. It's that first night of Anschluss, the breaking of families. So I called it During the Night, and then in darkness, I put together a whole sort of collection of Kunstkammer works. This is much brighter than it was. It caused fury in the Viennese population because they could hardly see the objects. But the point was that you moved through shadows and you found things. You found strange Wunderkammer things, you found broken things, you had the Dürer image, you had images of anxiety. And this whole thing was really, and I made this huge installation called During the Night, which was the first use of black porcelain for me. Not white porcelain, but black porcelain. And I made this in my studio in London, which was a gun factory. When I bought the gun factory, I found all these extraordinary tubs and crates of gunpowder in the factory. And so this has lead shot and gunpowder in it. Black. Anyway, this is the piece I made. But then I showed this work. And no, hang on. And that was my way of trying to talk powerfully but respectfully into the collection. It wasn't an easy exhibition. It wasn't supposed to be an easy exhibition. It wasn't meant to be polemical. It was supposed to be revealing. Does that? If yes. I can make that distinction, it's an important distinction for me to make. This wasn't about making huge banners going, the lost, but it was absolutely about talking into institutional memory, using objects that were in their collection, most of which they had not shown or were disregarded, and had that kind of that quality of danger for me about them. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Exposing the things that might be uncomfortable
Yeah.
or awkward. Now, you just mentioned that you have reclaimed your Austrian citizenship.
Yeah.
How was that as a decision? Because it can't be easy to say, I want to belong to this country that once very much did not want me.
So it happened that 7 years ago, Austria passed a law allowing Holocaust-era families to have dual citizenship, to reclaim their citizenship. And my father, who's 96, did it immediately, as he says it, in honour of his parents. And that was really straightforward for him and really moving. And one of the great things of my life was that publishing The Hare with Amber Eyes allowed my dad to go back to Vienna, the place that he couldn't remember anything about. And I went for the German launch of the book. We did it in the courtyard of the Palais Ephrussi, our old family home. And that was, I think, the most amazing moment of my life, because he took my two sons, very small sons, off, having said that he couldn't remember anything about his childhood, up the great staircase to find his childhood bedroom. So for him, sorry, I must recover myself. For him, bringing back citizenship made complete sense. For my brothers, it was really straightforward because they all wanted to be European citizens, and hooray, I'd done the work. For me, it's taken years and years and years to do it, because I spent so bloody long in those archives going through the deportation lists, and the lists of the looted objects, in family houses, and then the extraordinary stuff about all the families where there is no trace at all of their. So I'd spent years doing that stuff. So for me to put my hand up and say I'm going to become an Austrian citizen was a big deal, and I don't know how it's going to play out for me, to be honest.
You could run for
entre nous.
You could run for the Chancellor.
I could run for Chancellor, and who knows. Okay, that was my stump speech.
Well, I'm not an Austrian,
but I'm deep emotional territory here. You'll have to excuse me if I go a little glitchy at times.
No, I think it's the same depth and force that you get from the books, I think. So it's true to life. Another opportunity that came your way in the wake of The Hare with Amber Eyes was to do a show at the Frick, which is, almost antithetical, once again, to the apparent style of your work, if not the full content. How did you go about, how do you start with the Frick, where they say, please have the run, do something?
With complete terror in your heart. Like everyone else, I've adored the Frick. And in fact, actually, again, it's in my life since being a teenager. And of course, my feeling about it was that the Frick is not only every single picture that you love, and we can all of us walk around the Frick, close our eyes, and walk into the Frick and walk our way around every single picture. But of course, it's also an extraordinary collection of furniture and decorative arts. Absolutely extraordinary. There are things there. Duveen was involved, and other people too. So what I wanted to do was to kind of talk to Frick's extraordinary sense of place making throughout the space. So I actually chose the places that mattered to me most. The Fragonard room, I made a golden vitrine with a sort of a scent of porcelain bowls and fragments. I talked to this Goutier table, to Duccio. This is now, of course, in this great Siena exhibition which just opened in after the Met. Here, a series of black vitrines on a Boule table with black porcelain and lead, but trying at all moments not to be present, but not interfere too much in the viewing across and through the galleries. So I wanted to be present because, damn it, I'm here at the Frick, and I'm allowed.
Yes.
But at the same time, not to dominate anything at all. So it's navigating that extremely complicated conversation about how do you do, why do you do, and how do you do contemporary art in historic interiors. And it's in many ways it's that really interesting and engaging question that so many people. We began a breakfast this morning talking about it with a museum director. That we all can remember sorry, this is oversharing, isn't it? We can all remember the projects where we've just felt offended by coming into a place that we love and then finding contemporary art when we didn't want to find contemporary art. At the same time, contemporary art can animate, bring different audiences in, or reveal particular moments, in life. And in fact, actually, it was a great joy to be doing it. It really was, a great, huge joy. The Frick is wonderful, and is about to reopen in a week's time, 2 weeks' time.
So we are all
see you there.
Yes, we're all very excited.
Yeah.
I'm going to do something to you that I hate when people do to me.
Yeah.
I'm going to read you a quote from your work. No, I hate when people do it to me because I've forgotten and I think they're going to sue me when they do. I'm not going to sue you. But you talk in your book, The White Road, which is about your obsession with porcelain, about, for me, this is a metaphor for influence. You say you buy these blue and white shards because the cluster of characters inside the well of a foot tell you when the pot was made. They indicate the reign of an emperor. They have value because you can make a new vase or bowl and insert these characters into your creation and fire it very slowly. And you have made a homage worth 50 times what your ordinary pot would make. So to me, that idea of using shards in your own work is a metaphor for influence.
Yeah.
It's the way that you assemble the things that have come before. Did you intend it like that? Was that a reflection on the way that you mentally approach some of your work?
Keep asking me the question. I'm not quite sure there yet. I mean, I can talk to you about shards.
Well, tell me about.
I'm not sure about the influence of. I mean, I suppose my relationship to shards is embedded in storytelling. So shards have broken edges. A shard is a broken piece of pottery. I know you all know this, but for those folks at home, a shard is a broken piece of pottery. Therefore, something has happened. History has happened. Family has happened. Events have happened. Time has happened. And so immediately, and they're painful. A shard isn't an easy thing to hold. So I'm drawn to shards because I'm drawn to complicated, unresolved bits of history. Whether it's my own family history or it's history of porcelain or its particular places. And so, that kind of return, that iterative idea about what do you do when you find something broken in the world? You can't mend the world, but you can understand it better if you put the strong beam of light onto the shard and try and work out what happened and when it happened.
So you're currently working on a project where you're using kintsugi around a broken Meissen dinner service.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. In fact, why don't we miss out on the commando?
Okay.
Well, okay, we're going to get to the shards via this. No, what should we do?
No,
Kintsugi. Let me talk to you about
Tell me
kintsugi.
about the Meissen service.
So the Meissen service. So perhaps the nice person could get us to slide number 101, which is a broken plate. Is that possible? It's probably not 101 anymore, but if you can find a picture of a broken plate. There we go, magic.
Perfect.
Okay, so in 2011, without telling my wife, who was not watching us at home, I bought a broken Meissen dinner service. In 1938, in Dresden, the von Klemperer family, incredibly wonderful, civilized, musical, philanthropic Jewish family, had their house and their lives taken apart like everyone else across Germany. They had the greatest private collection of Meissen, non-aristocratic collection of Meissen. In Germany, and in 1945, in February 1945, this really is extraordinary, Josh, that whole collection was on a truck in Dresden, being taken away from the approaching Red Army during the firebombing, the destruction of Dresden by the British and American Air Force. After the war, in the rubble of Dresden, they found broken porcelain, and they put it in boxes, and it was in the vaults of the porcelain collection until 2009, when they found these extraordinary boxes full of broken porcelain and realized it was the von Klemperer collection, restituted these broken things back to the family. The family generously gave most of them to the porcelain collections of SKD, and some came up for auction, and I bought them. You can see there, can you see across the top on the right-hand side, a kind of shadow? That's the fire markings of the bombing of Dresden. So these pots, porcelain has been through the fire. You know, it's been through the fire once, but this has been through the fire twice. So I bought this collection, and for the last 10 years, a Japanese artist, Maiko Tsutsumi, has been doing kintsugi on it. Kintsugi is this very powerful metaphorical art, Japanese and also Chinese art, which is that where you have a broken object that matters to you, something that has had a life and has some power and agency for you. And I remember this as a teenager in Japan, having tea ceremony with a tea master who gave me a bowl with kintsugi lip to it, and I realized it was something happening. And so she's been doing this to these plates. Now, kintsugi is really important because it's not repair. Really, can I emphasize that enough?
Please.
Thump the table. It's not repair. Kintsugi is the art of marking loss. It's the art of tracing damage and holding damage in an object beautifully and carefully and lyrically. And so these plates, and we have 18 of them, and we've used them for Passover, we use them for Christmas, and they're now also in museums. I've shown them in Dresden. I showed them in the Japanische Palais in Dresden, which is, of course, an extraordinary building that was built by Augustus the Strong for his porcelain collections and then destroyed in the war. So I showed them there, and I've showed them in different places, and I've just actually given one to the Jewish Museum in New York, and one to Dresden, and one to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, but I'm keeping a dozen for myself because they really, really, really matter to me. But kintsugi, this idea of how you tell a story with imperative, with power, feels to me a really significant thing. It's how I work across the different things I do.
Oh no, and I think people who read your books will also notice, the stitches are the point.
Yes, exactly. Yes, thank you. I'll steal that.
You can have that.
Thank you very much.
We've got a couple of minutes left before we take questions, so please have them ready. But let's ask, what have you got coming up next? What's the next thing you're excited about? You've got a project with the Huntington, I believe?
I'm working with the Huntington, the beautiful, extraordinary, in Pasadena, which is an art gallery. Well, you all know it. It's the art gallery and the library and the botanical gardens. So it's a project really about kintsugi, actually. And I've made a new library, a library of a sanctuary library in the library, and then working through the museum with porcelain installations, and then down into the Chinese gardens, where there's a Chinese pavilion, where I've made a pavilion to go inside the pavilion, which is full of shards from Jing to Zhen and across the world, and then into the Japanese gardens, where I've made a shadow pavilion, which is going to really annoy people because they can barely see in, but it's got beautiful things inside if you spend long enough. So there's the Huntington, and then a show in LA, and then so many museums. I've got a list. I've got museums, which is lovely.
You should have them tattooed up.
I should have them tattooed. And the joy of TEFAF is that I walk through TEFAF and all these lovely museum people, half a dozen here, keep saying like this to me. So I'm very, very privileged. I'm also writing another book, but you didn't hear that.
Well, that's something to look forward to. We have to break for 1 second to say thank you to Edmund, and then we'll come back and then we'll have the questions. This is because of an online thing. So please thank Edmund.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff.
Now there is a mic coming round, so please put your hand up. And if
there may be no,
okay.
There may be no question. Oh, there are.
This lady here. Yep. Lady here, and then we'll come to that gentleman.
Edmund, hi.
Hi.
I read your book, The Hare with the Amber Eyes, a long time ago. And I remember feeling very, very much when I read it that it was your story, your personal story. And it was very personal to you. But since then, I have been to Vienna and I've seen signs around saying Edmund de Waal's family lived here or Edmund de Waal. And I just wonder how you feel about other people sort of invading your story in that way.
That's a really, really interesting question. And the way I navigate that, it's a seriously interesting question, is I completely ignore it. I work on the principle that no one has read my book, and no one knows anything, and I never watch anything I've done or listen to any radio program or television program about me or anything like that, because for me it's I don't want it to get thinned, if that makes sense. I don't want the reality of the personal story to I don't want it to get too easy. So I know there's all that stuff happening in Vienna. And that's fine. I just ignore it. What I did do was to work with the Jewish Museum in Vienna and the Jewish Museum in New York to make an exhibition. And that was a very personal and complicated experience, which I loved. It was working with Liz Diller, an amazing, amazing architect, who did the High Line. I mean, an incredible architect who made an extraordinary exhibition with the book and with the Impressionist paintings and with the objects and family stuff. And that I allowed to happen, and I was thrilled by that. The rest, I'm not looking at it.
Thank you. Gentleman there. And if you could speak into the mic.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Just curious, there's one little bit you skipped over when you talked about the 7 years you spent writing the book and no one was interested. How did it happen? How did it come to be published and cause everything that you've told?
It was a beautiful thing, which was that I'd written most of it, and I mentioned to a lovely design journalist called Fiona McCarthy, who died a few years ago, great writer and biographer. And she put a little thing in a Guardian profile, Guardian in London profile, that I was writing this book, and I had a postcard from an editor at Chatto saying, "If you ever finish it." And then I did finish it, and it went out across the world to different publishers, and it got rejected by all but that one person in London and one person in New York, Jonathan Galassi, who you know, love. So it got picked up by 2 people, and in Germany, and do you want the figures? 2 million copies.
Incredible. And
And 32 languages. So, you know what? If you want a miracle, here I am sitting on a very comfortable sofa, and it's an absolute miracle. But I finished it, and then it happened. It wasn't a proposal.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please put your hand up. Yes, lady back there. And please speak into the mic.
How much of the collection is refound, the family collection? Because, see, there are bounty hunter lawyers out there helping you, willing to help you. Countries are getting more lenient towards, giving back pieces from musea. Are you involved with that?
Some things have been returned over the years. One of the sort of saddest things was, of course, my grandmother just giving up, in the 50s, just because it was just impossible and no one was interested. And you know those stories. I mean, absolutely dreadful stories. So some things have been retrieved. There's still, I think, 30, 40 old master paintings still lost, stolen. I tell you what's really shocking is that there was a huge painting. If you look at Josh and then look at all this huge wall here, there was a huge painting that was discovered on the walls of the military museum in Vienna, which is about 400 yards away from the Palais Ephrussi 3 years ago. And in the records, it said 1946. It says this belongs to the heirs of Ritter Victor von Ephrussi, but they'll never find it. And they hadn't done their due diligence. They hadn't gone through the records. And so we've got the painting back, and I've given it to the Jewish Museum in Vienna. I mean, what do I do? I mean, so I've given it to the museum. I mean, it's not for selling things. The question for me is, where do things work best in the world? Where are they going to work hardest in the world? So the netsuke collection now is on long-term loan in the Jewish Museum in Vienna, because that's where that story is going to work hardest. And it's only on long-term loan. I will have it back. But it's a very good question, and it's a painful question.
Person there.
Thank you, first of all, for the wonderful talk. And my question is, I've read your books, and my question is, has your art significantly changed before you wrote the book versus after you wrote the book, The Hare with the Amber Eyes? You talked about loss. You talked about broken. Is there hope? And how is your art evolved as a consequence of the history that you found of your family?
Thank you for that. That's a beautiful question. I mean, for me, it always evolves. It was evolving before I wrote the book. It continues to evolve. I'm writing more, and the things I make and the things I write are so closely intertwined. They really are. They walk hand in hand. In fact, the project we didn't talk about was a project at the Musée Camondo in Paris, where I had an invitation from a wonderful museum director to do an exhibition in this family house. And I gave him a book. And then I gave him an exhibition. Fabulous introduction by a friend of mine. So one thing intertwining with another into another. So it keeps evolving. you know, you've probably heard me talking a lot about loss and bereavement. And do you know what? I'm absolutely stick my ground on that. Those are things that are really significant, and they're not talked about in contemporary art, and they're not talked about in the worlds that I live in. It's also about beauty and solace. It's about recovery of extraordinary and wonderful human stories. It's about pleasure and tactility and passing things on. And so for me, it's how you navigate, you know, really complicated things and make something beautiful. I want to make something so beautiful that people fall over. They go, oh my God, and fall on the ground. You know, I really do. I'm interested in beauty. So, you know, it's those two things, those two pulses, I suppose, of energy, and getting them to work together. And it's a challenge, you know, but my God, you know, am I lucky? Yes, sorry, the answer was yes, yes, profoundly, yes. Profoundly lucky. I'm profoundly lucky that I get up and I work at the things that I want to work at. And it might be a book, it might be an exhibition, it might be curation, it might be walking a dog. But all those things are part of my life.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I think we might have run out of questions.
No,
oh, no, there's one more.
Person at the back.
Thank you. Just coming back to the original purpose of the netsukes, which was to be fasteners for clothing, obviously not quite in line with form follows function. They were overly decorated for that, but now they're completely devoid of any useful function, thanks to zippers being invented and buttons being brought to Japan. So if you look at objects in museums, what is their function? Is it the haptic element, or is it to be a catalyst for memories and going back in time, which then, if it's the latter, that would then beg the question, is that going to be the justification for museums still to be around in a purely virtual world?
Okay. Lock the doors. This is the next seminar. Because you're right. You're right. It's a very interesting line of thinking. You know, absolutely, objects are catalytic in collections, and so you know they in the sense that they inspire and they engender questions and storytelling and connections between people, which is very, very, very significant, and generationally across all kinds of boundaries, so-called boundaries. So how you display and think about your collections is incredibly important, and how you can get your audiences to handle things or move through collections is hugely important. There's some wonderful examples out there. There are a lot of people here who are doing that. Sod the digital. I mean, really, come on. You know, the digital is very significant in this world, but it's absolutely about the encounter with the non-digital world that is very, very, very significant. I really, truly believe that. It's about being present. You know, if you can stand on 2 feet, doesn't matter. As many feet as you can stand on in a place, in a museum, with a collection, next to someone else. So, so, so important. How you bring your audiences together digitally, wonderful, extraordinary, beautiful things. But actually, it's all about that encounter. And the miraculous thing about that encounter is that it is a complete body encounter. It's not just the visual world. It's your whole body being near a work of art. We've got another hour, but that's a start. That's a start. Catalytic is the right word to end on.
I'm still stuck on the beginning of that gentleman's question, whether the zipper is the downfall of art.
Yes.
I think, do we have...
Bravo. I think that's a great...
I think we've got time for one more question. That gentleman over there.
Well, thank you for your talk. It was very inspiring. I have a very pragmatic question to your porcelain work. I have many friends who have your work, and I'm always afraid that it has a certain sequence, and if somebody cleans it or if I touch it, I'll put it back in a wrong order. What do you suggest?
You email me.
I will.
I await your call.
You will.
Thank you. Edmund, you said just a second ago that it's all about the encounter, and I think we're all very glad to have encountered you today. Thank you very much.
Josh, I've loved it. I've loved it. I loved it. Thank you, Josh.